Okay, we're rolling on the slate. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
Question?
Okay, no, I'm fine.
Okay. 3, 2, 1, and okay.
Okay, shall I put it down
Yeah,
now?
sure.
Okay, good. So start?
Yeah, uh-oh. You've lost your mic already. It's good to... We are rolling.
Okie doke. I was born in 1935, and my family was from Karlsbad, Karlovy Vary, which is in the western third of Czechoslovakia. And my family, the Rindlers and Zentners, had been in these Czech lands since the 1700s. They felt they belonged. Both my grandfathers, Richard Rindler and Leopold Zentner, were veterans of World War I, and they thought that that held them in great esteem in the society of the day. In fact, my grandfather, Leopold Zentner, received a medal from the Bohemian government for his meritorious services. My family was very assimilated. We're very Jewish, but we're very reformed in our beliefs. We didn't look different from anybody else. We didn't speak differently. We didn't wear different clothes, and frankly, we didn't eat different foods. They thought they were assimilated. Czechoslovakia was a newly minted democracy after World War I, and under Masaryk and Beneš, minority groups were embraced. There was a short time after World War I and the beginnings of World War II in Czechoslovakia, the shining democracy, that if you worked hard, you could do well. And my family were indeed hard workers. On my father's side, Grandpa Richard had Auto Avia, and it was a concern that sold the early Praga automobiles. And they also had a small factory where they customized cars. And the families intermingled in the society. My father's dear friend was the owner of the Becker Bitter beer. My mother was good friends with the local policeman and the local priest. Again, they thought they belonged and they were living a good life. They also were very active physically. This was a robust group of people. If they weren't skiing or hiking, they were in their foul boats. Or, in fact, my father, in the very late 20s and early 30s, even had his own little glider plane. And this goes against some people's visions of Central Eastern European jewelry. You were noted how much of a family person you were, but you were also noted if you could climb to high lengths and not complain, and how good you were athletically. So thinking about the way we lived, this really was a good life. This was a golden period for about 20 years. And this good life was to end far too soon. In 1938, the European allies, meaning the French, the English, and the Italians, were getting very concerned about Hitler's militaristic speeches. He was not supposed to rearm after the Treaty of Versailles, but all of a sudden he was rearming, he was conscripting men into the military service, and giving these very militaristic speeches, Germany over everything. And of course, everything that was wrong with the world, the inflation, the conditions of the society, everything that was wrong with the world was the fault of the Jews. And the European allies were concerned. They wanted peace in their time. And so they called the high-up Nazi officials together in Munich in 1938. and they asked Hitler and his henchmen, "What do you want? We want peace in our time." And Hitler's higher-ups henchmen said, "If you will let us march into the western third of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, that's all we want from Europe." And under Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister at the time, the Europeans agreed to sell the proud democratic country of Czechoslovakia down the river and allowed them to march in and take over where I lived. And this was in 1938 in September, followed 2 months later by Kristallnacht. And for my family, the people who I've spoken to who were adults at the time, it wasn't one day the Sudetenland takeover and one day Kristallnacht. It was 1 2 to 3 month period of horror for the families. First of all, they came in, and one of the first places they took was Grandpa Richard's Auto Avia. It was always very important for the Germans to take Jewish property and Jewish wealth. They also took over the flats the families lived in, and they took over any material wealth they could manage to take of the families, including bank accounts and whatever valuables they thought that the Jewish families, including my family, had that they could use, mostly for the military effort. And it was then not only material things. If you were a Jewish person and you were walking on the street, you could be grabbed and thrown into the first concentration camp, and there would be no recourse. You could be beaten up as a Jew, and there would be no recourse. The families were very scared. My darling grandmother, Anna, on my father's side, became so terrorized and impacted that she was unable to speak anymore. And the families said that Hitler is a clown. This is going to go away. What we need to do is pack up a few belongings and travel to the east. And we will settle into small rural villages. We'll be very quiet. This will blow over and we can go back to our good lives. And so the families on both sides, the Rindlers on my father's side, the Zentners on my mother's side, grabbed a few belongings and they headed east towards the Polish border. Something very strange happened on this trip. First of all, as a little 3-year-old who had been used to a nice life, I asked my mother, "Do you think we're rabbits because all you give us to eat is cabbage?" My mother couldn't find food for us. And more significantly than that, all of a sudden, these Czechs who my family thought they were so assimilated with, now they wouldn't sell a Jewish family a loaf of bread, they wouldn't put up a Jewish family, they wouldn't speak to a Jewish family, they would have nothing to do with us. We finally made it to 2 small towns called Bardejov and Bradyabad along the Polish border, and we tried to live very quietly. Again, the adults in the family thought the professional people could not believe these horrible things that Hitler was saying, and soon this will all be over. But another strange thing happened to us along the Polish border, and that was we were met with so much aggression and hostility. At that time, the people along the Polish border were very anti-Semitic, and they wanted nothing to do with us, and they treated my family terribly, and so the family did not feel safe in their original plan. The next thought they had was, well, it's not working for us in small towns along the Polish border. Our next move is going to be to travel back to Prague, and their thinking was they would try to get lost in a large cosmopolitan city. that they would try to find a couple of rooms, and then whoever found a couple of rooms, the rest of the family could move in with them, and they would just live as simply and as quietly as they can. You have to remember, by this time, the material things had been taken away from them. They had very, very little. And so they couldn't afford to rent like a big apartment, but they just rented whatever small facility they could get. And they were thinking at this time that we'll be quiet, nobody will pay attention to us, the thinking people in our society will turn down Hitler and all his racist views. We can go back to our beloved Carl Spad, now Carlo Vivari, and go back to the life we had previously. And as you know, this was not to happen for my dear family. In 1939, in the spring, Hitler takes over all of Czechoslovakia. He goes against the Munich Agreement. In the Munich Agreement, he said the only thing he wants is Lebensraum, living space for Germany, but now he's lying and he's taking over the whole country of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia, of course, was very centrally located, and Hitler needed to be in control of Czechoslovakia so he could attack Poland. And then he also needed the industry, the Skoda works, the industry of Czechoslovakia. It was then that my father, Rudy Rindler, did a very brave thing. And I'm sure that this decision is why I am here today. As a Jew, he decided it didn't matter what the other members of the family were thinking, but his family of four, meaning my mother, Emmy, my sister, Eva, he and I, our family of four, we were going to leave. If the rest of the family, this large, lovely, extended family, if they wanted to stay, okay, but we were going to leave. But he needed 2 documents. You needed 2 documents to leave. And the only place you could get those was at the Gestapo, the hated state police. And I guess I didn't bring them over. So my father, Rudy Rindler, as a Jew, presents himself to the Gestapo. What bravery. He goes to the interrogator and he says to the interrogator, I need the 2 documents so that my family can leave Czechoslovakia. One document was called Durchlassen, meaning that you could travel through. And another document, after they had taken everything of yours, you had to prove that you had paid all taxes to the Third Reich. That was the second document that you needed. My dad goes to the interrogator. The interrogator proceeds to call him horrible names, beats him up and says, why should I help you, you dirty Jew? I'm not giving you anything. I'm not helping you. And then the door opens and a Czech man sees my dad sitting there. And this was a gentleman that now was probably working for the Nazis in a job capacity. And he looks at my dad and he says, that's Rudy Rindler. My family always bought cars from Richard Rindler, and they always treated us well, just give him what he wants. So with that stroke of luck, the Nazi interrogator throws the 2 precious documents at my dad and says, okay, here. And he tells my dad, you can't take anything with you. You can only take some travel money and a small suitcase per person. And so my dad comes home and he tells my mother, Emmy Rindler, that we are leaving, but we cannot take anything with us. On my father's side, the immediate family gets together one last time before we leave. And if you'll notice this lovely lady over here, this is my mother. And she is wearing a long wool coat. And I'm the youngest one over here. That's me. She's wearing a long wool coat. My dad told her that the Nazis said, "You cannot take anything with you." But my mother, knowing that she was going to have to provide for her family of 4, decided, against my dad's knowledge, that she would gather any jewelry that she could get her hands on, and she would sew them in the lining of this coat. And she didn't tell my father that she had done that, because he would not have allowed it, hadn't been so terrorized earlier with needing to get the 2 documents. So the family now says a tearful goodbye to grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, extended family, and we leave. It was the Quakers that helped our family get through these German towns. Having left on these trains, we didn't know where to go. We knew we were leaving Czechoslovakia, but we didn't know where to go. And the only thing my dad had in his possession, frankly, was a visa to Chile in South America. And the reason he had that is a lot of the Jews at that moment in time had visas to Chile, because the ambassador from Chile to Prague was known to want to leave the office in the middle of the day for his jauze, his afternoon tea. And if you got to him right before he wanted to leave, he would throw out the visas. And so a lot of these people had these visas from this one man. He wasn't being particularly humanitarian, he just wanted to leave, and this was his way of doing it. Okay. And well, anyway, the family had no means to get to Chile, but they did have that in their possession. My dad decided that we would go to Holland just to hole up and think. We were not going to stay in Holland, because this was 1939, and most thinking people were aware that Hitler was going to take over the Low Countries, including Holland, of course, but they didn't know when. But my dad thought if we could just have some thinking time and some discovery time, that this is what he would do. And so we go to Holland. And my family did not live in the community. We went into hiding. And I've had to research this particular issue. Why didn't we just rent a room and live among the people? Because Hitler in 1939 was not there. And I found 3 reasons why. First of all, the Dutch, by this 1939 time period, had received so many refugees, mostly from Germany, that they had now said, we can't take in more people, the borders are closed. Up until now, the Dutch had been very forthcoming. If you wanted to come to our country, come. But now, we just can't take in more people. And the second reason, of course, was nobody knew just when Hitler was going to take over, and you didn't want to be out there in the open if he was going to take over. And the third reason that I have found out, in Holland at that time, there were some traders who were reporting back to the Germans, and it was their job, kind of a 5th column. They believed in the ideals of the Nazis, and their job was to find out where Jews were, who was supporting Jews, and they were reporting back to Germany. And they were called the NS-Bayers, the National Socialistic Bewegung movement. And they were very organized, and they were very active. And so my dad, knowing that these 3 things were happening, his decision was that we wouldn't live in the open, we would go into hiding. My mother, Emmy Rindler, takes some of the jewelry from the lining of her coat, and she gives it to a Dutch woman who hides us in her attic. We are in the attic, knowing it's going to be temporary. And my dad was going out during the day, and he was asking people, what can a family of 4 of us, what could be our next move? Asking anybody he could get some information from. And we were quietly in this lady's attic. One day, however, these NS Bayers, the traitor group, the fifth column group, comes downstairs, and they're talking to the woman who is the owner of the house, and they're saying to her, "We hear you're harboring Jews. Why would you want to help Jews?" And he was saying they're dirty and they steal, and bringing up all the libels that have been around Europe for so many centuries. And my sister Eva, in her 6-year-old resistance, they were speaking German, and in the Sudetenland we understood German very well. We understood German more, frankly, than Czech. And she knew that we were clean, we were good people, and we didn't do all these horrible things. And she had some marbles in her possession, and she squeezed the marbles down on top of these NS Bayers' head through the rafters, and they say, "Okay, we're leaving, we'll bring reinforcements." Luck again. They left, and the second they went out the door, we went out the door. And in my dad's asking around, he had found, this was March, April, I think now we were into April of 1939, that if you could get to England in the next 2 weeks, you could enter that country without a visa. Luck. And so, again, with my mother's jewelry, we make it to England. And first thing my dad does is he registers with the British Home Office. And by now, the British people, particularly those in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords, had realized that their Neville Chamberlain had done a terrible thing in the Munich Agreement. It was not peace in our time, as the newspaper headlines showed. And some of them, particularly in the government, the House of Lords in particular, in their own way wanted to do something because they realized this Neville Chamberlain had done a horrible thing by letting the Nazis take over the Sudetenland. And so this Lord and Lady Cottesloe had let it be known to the British Home Office that they wanted to take in a family with children from the Sudetenland. And that became our family. And so this lovely Lord and Lady took us into their home. And they were very, very gracious to us. And you might say, "Oh, great. But now I'm taking you to 1940, and we're starting the Blitzkrieg." And our family became part of that. The German bombers would come screeching in, and we'd hear the sirens, and we'd put on our gas mask canisters and go downstairs, and the rumble, 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 and get up as soon as the all clear sounded and go up to see what had happened. My dad decided that it was very nice of the Lord and Lady to put us up in their manor, cottages in their manor, but he wanted to support his family in a more normal way. And so he went out looking for work. And he was looking for work in Coventry one night. And he was involved in that horrific bombing of Coventry, where Hitler was going to use that as the example, how he was going to decimate the English cities. Right there. Luck, my dad survived that horrific bombing. And I have seen pictures of the morning after in Coventry, and it's hard to imagine anybody surviving that rubble and bombing and terror. The other thing that was going on in England for us was food was very scarce. No one starved in England. People were living off their victory gardens, but it was definitely a hard existence. The Lord and Lady offered to adopt Eva and I. Here were these two good little girls. We had changed from being just normal kids to being extremely good. We did whatever we were told. And the Lord and Lady were elderly, and their kids had grown. And they offered to adopt us in case Hitler would come over and take over England, because no one knew if this was going to happen. But interestingly enough, they baptized us into the Church of England as part of this process, because it was one thing to take two little girls, but they didn't want to take two Jewish girls. So I became Susanna Margaret Rindler, and my sister became Eva Dorothy. We got new middle names from the Lord and Lady. And that was kind of an aside. They really, really meant well. And I still, in my possession today, have a letter that the lady wrote about my father as he was going looking for work, saying that he was an educated man and an ally to the country, and recommending him for work, and also that if we wanted, and we could always come back. So these were good people. You always find good people, even in horrible situations. I had an uncle now. His name was Leo, and he was a doctor, and he was the only other member of the family in Prague who decided to come to England. The British would not let him practice medicine because he had not fulfilled their particular requirements, even though he had been educated in Vienna and was, an accredited European doctor. And the British gave my darling Uncle Leo, my dad's brother, farm machinery to run. This was going to be his part of the war effort. This doctor knew nothing about farm machinery, and he managed to topple it over on himself, and he was so mangled that he proceeded to kill himself. He committed suicide because, as a doctor, he knew there was no medical available to him. He knew what was in store for him. So unfortunately, that's what happened to my darling Uncle Leo. And now I'd like to take our thoughts to the family living in Prague. We're in England. We're grieving the loss of Uncle Leo. My dad found a job, and we're doing the best we can. But now I'd like for us to think about the family living in Prague under the Nazi occupation. My dad had some cousins, the Krugers, and they had changed their religion from being Jewish to being Protestant in the early 1900s, way before the stirrings of World War II and the Holocaust. And they said to themselves, well, it's terrible what's happening to our Jewish family and friends, but we're not Jewish. What could happen to us? We're going to be okay. The Germans came to them and they said, we need for you to get some work clothes, and you're going to work in Kovno, Lithuania. You're going to go on a train, and we have some work that you need to do. And so that's exactly what they did. And as they arrived to their destination and were going down the stairs, the Germans met them with machine guns and shot them all. So these people who thought they weren't Jewish and fared in some ways worse because they didn't try to protect themselves. But that's kind of an odd statement because the family who stayed decided to stay too. So it's people's thinking, was so individual. Everybody had their own views on what was going to happen. So how was the family now living in Prague? First of all, the Jewish people were now having to wear the Star of David as identification. And if you were a Jewish man, you now had to add Israel to your middle name. And here is my darling Uncle Carl's Reisepass. And his name is no longer Karl Rindler, it's Karl Israel Rindler. If you were a Jewish adult, you could not work. If you were a Jewish child, you could not go to school. You could be, again, beaten up, harmed in any way, and nobody would come to your assistance. They would have brown shirts going up and down the streets with these loudspeakers, and they'd be yelling horrible things about Jews, fomenting anti-Semitism. If you were a Jew, I always forget all these, so I have it written down. If you were a Jew, You couldn't be in a taxi, a restaurant, a coffee house, a playground, a hospital, or a nursing home. If you had a Jewish ration card, you could only shop at certain hours of the day. Your ration card was marked with a J, and that J marking was at the request of the Swiss government. And you could only shop certain periods of time. You couldn't work. They had taken everything from you. And when a Jew went shopping, the prices went up. And if you were a Jew, you could not buy white bread, meat, eggs, fruit, jam, cheese, dairy products, sweets, fish, poultry, game, yeast, or sauerkraut. So what was left? I would think some root vegetables and some brown bread is about what was left. The picture I like to paint of my dear family living under Nazi occupation was that these were not healthy people by now. If there was no way to make a living, you couldn't buy healthy food, you were in fear of being terrorized at any time, you couldn't receive any medical help. So your health was going, your mental health was gone. And even before my dear family was dragged to the ghetto concentration camp, these were not healthy people. You might say, well, how do you know what was going on with your family? You weren't there. Well, two things. I have researched it, and also some information was sent on some thin pieces of paper to Switzerland and back to us in England. And it was kind of in code, talking about the living conditions and saying that, well, we haven't seen so-and-so for a long time, which meant that they had been grabbed off and nobody had seen them again. Or something has happened to so-and-so's baby, just little bits of information. And so we kind of did get information about how the families were faring under the Nazi occupation. And I'm taking you now to the early 1940s, 1941, going into 42. The families were living under these horrible conditions in Prague, and two things happened to seal their fate forever. The Nazis had decided in Wannsee, near Berlin, that the final solution to the Jewish problem was that they would kill all Jews in Europe. So their fate was sealed. Escape routes were closed. The other thing that happened right in the area where they lived in Prague. In Prague, the protectorate was managed by this blonde beast, hated man by all, Jews and Czech Gentiles, everybody, Reinhard Heydrich. And there were some Czech patriots in England, and they decided we're going to make a stand. And they flew over Prague, parachuted down, and they decided they would assassinate the hated blonde beast Reinhard Heydrich. They were successful in killing him, and you might say, well, here's a step in the right direction. But indeed, what happened was, as you can imagine, great retaliation. Two small towns in Czechoslovakia, including Lidice, were just ruined. All the buildings were ruined, and the adults were either killed or sent to concentration camps, and the children, if they looked Aryan enough, were sent to live with some Gestapo people, or they were indeed killed. And if you visit Lidice today, you'll see a memorial to the children. And so with these two things happening, the fate of my family didn't exist in a vacuum. It happened because things were going on historically at the same time. And in 1942, the families, the Rindlers and the Zentners, the aunts, uncles, cousins, extended family members, got the dreaded notice that they were to take a few belongings and they were to go to the Trade Fair Center in Prague. they were going to be processed to the ghetto concentration camp Theresienstadt. And so now, what met my family there? First of all, Terezin was a ghetto. It was the Germans' way to know who was Jewish and to put them in a ghetto so they would have complete control. So Theresienstadt was, in that way, a ghetto. Terezin was also very much a transit center. To comply with the final solution, the families, my family and other Jewish people, of course, were to be sent to the killing centers to the east. So Terezin was a ghetto. It was a transit center. It was a concentration camp because of the brutality of treatment, the overcrowding, the lack of hygiene, the lack of enough calories to sustain life. And the older people got less food than the younger people, and my grandparents, who were probably in their late 50s, were considered older people. And Terezin was also a place where 15,000 children traveled through at one time or another, and most of the statistics that I can find is that only about 100 or so survived. So I'm fully aware that if my dad had not made that decision that his family of 4 was to leave, it's very unlikely that I would be here today to tell the family story. And Terezin was also used by the Germans for false propaganda. The infamous Red Cross visits, where the Red Cross came and they gave the Germans 3 to 4 months notice before they came to make a very short visit, and they proclaimed to the International Red Cross and the Danish government that indeed Hitler was treating Jews all right. The visit was a complete failure. What was right was wrong. What was true was false. And historians feel that the concentration camp system might have been shortened had this Red Cross Commission not been so fooled. So at this point in my thinking, I need to share with you what happened to each one of my family members, immediate family members, in this horrible place of Theresienstadt. This is my wonderful cousin Peter. He would have been 5 years older than me, and he lasted in Terezin till 1944. He was dragged there in that horrible year of 1942, and as much as I can ascertain, it was very unusual for somebody to survive 2 years in that horrible place. In October of 1944, there was one last roundup of Jewish people to Auschwitz, and they particularly wanted to make sure there were no teenage boys or men around, because the war was going badly and they didn't want teenage boys or men to be able to be of resistance. And so it was then in October of 1944 that my cousin Peter was sent on the horrible cattle cars to Auschwitz, and he was murdered there. His father, Karl Rindler, was dragged from Terezin to Auschwitz with his son Peter, and my Uncle Carl was the only one of the family who stayed to survive. And we know that 80 to 90% of Jews in Czechoslovakia were murdered by the Germans of the Third Reich. And so my family's statistics are unfortunately part of this. And he was dragged from Terezin to Auschwitz. He did survive, but I'd like to share something of his survival a little later. His wife, Valerie, died of the conditions of Terezin. I think, near as we can tell, she had a medical condition that was not treated, and the starvation. My grandfather, Richard Rindler, he was the great patriarch of the Rindler family, the owner of Alto Avia, the skier, the hiker, the family man. He died of the conditions of Terezin, probably starvation. His wife, my grandmother on my father's side, Anna Rindler, the lady who was unable to speak after the Sudetenland takeover, died of the conditions of Terezin, the brutality, the filth. My grandmother on my mother's side, Ida Zentner-Ova. My mother missed her mother so much growing up. Ida was a cultured woman, a modern woman. She worked. She had a job. She was very loving, very much a family person again. And she was dragged to Terezin that horrible year of 1942. And she was sent very immediately on a transport of about 2,000 to Treblinka. And she did not survive the day of arrival. My grandfather, Leopold Zentner, the one that got the medal from the Bohemian government, he was also dragged to Terezin in 1942, and he was put on a transport to Mali Trostenets up towards Minsk. And the poor dear people on these transports were gassed en route to their destination. So most of them, when they arrived to their destination, they were already dead. And if someone happened to have survived the gassing en route, they were made to dig their own ditches, and then they were shot as they fell into their graves. So that's what happened to my very darling Leopold Zentner, very much a skier and a hiker and proprietor of a family store and an extremely loving grandfather. So now I'd like to take us back to England. It's now October of '43. My father gets the notice from the American government that his family of 4 can now go to America, the best thing that could possibly happen to a Jewish family in Europe. We were told, we were living in Oxford at the time, we were told to just walk out the door, leave absolutely every belonging there, and report to the docks, and we were to go on a convoy of ships to cross the Atlantic. The convoy of ships did not take a straight path. They went zigzag. The Allies had radar now, and they thought it was safe to take civilians across the Atlantic. But unfortunately, the German submarines detected us, and they attacked our convoy of ships. And many of the ships were sunk, including an aircraft carrier. And again, luck, the ship that we were on made it to New York. We come to New York, and there's a British seaman. He sees these 2 scrawny little girls, my sister and I, and he wants to do something for us. And he rips the buttons off of his shirt, and he gives my sister and I buttons. And so here is another good person. We come to New York. We stay just a very short time, and we get on a train to come to Seattle. That's what my family thought Seattle was. And we started a new life in this very, very wonderful country. I want to go back a little bit and talk just a little bit more about my dear Uncle Carl. He survives terrorism. He survives Auschwitz. He's liberated by the Germans. Pardon me, what did I say? He's liberated by the Russians. Please take that sentence away. He's liberated by the Russians. He wants to go back to terrorism in the hopes of finding someone alive that he knew, some family member, someone. He goes back to terrorism, and now terrorism is embroiled in a huge epidemic of typhus. The Germans, in their last assault against humanity, sent the inmates from the eastern death camps on the horrible death marches, and they dump a lot of these people into terrorism, and these ill, sick, half-crazed people had many diseases, and there was a huge epidemic of typhus. And so now my uncle has to wait for this typhus epidemic to be controlled before he can enter Theresienstadt to see if he can find someone. He found no one, but he did associate himself with a lady who had also lost everything, and they decided to get married, and they were going to start a new life. They go back to Carlsbad Karlovy Vary and wanting to move back into their flats and start a new life. But people had moved into their places by now, and these occupants of the flats and the business said, "No, we don't want you here. We thought you'd be gone. You can't come back here." And so after surviving all that, losing his family, going back to his home, he wasn't wanted by his fellow Czechs because they had all his things. The only bright spot in that was that there was a secretary of my grandfather's who had saved some Rindler things like pictures, china, things that she thought were important to the family. And then after the war, she did give those back to Uncle Carl. And my dad was able to sponsor him, and he came to America. But his health was so impaired, he had been beaten over the head, and he'd been starved, and he did not last long in this country. But the woman that he married, Martha, lived to be almost 100 in San Leandro, California. And she is the reason that my sister and I have, original artwork from terrorism. And we have many family documents that you might wonder why would a family have, but we have a lot of things because some things were saved by this Elsie Hempel, who was secretary to Grandfather Richard, and then Martha and Carl had saved some of these belongings from terrorism. And people had their own portraits taken by the brave artists, and they would hide them because they wanted something to be left for posterity to show we were there. And also, the artists wanted to portray what life was really like in terrorism to counteract the propaganda. And many of the artists met terrible fates in the political prison in terrorism, the Kleine Festung. So I'd like to finish my family story by, I always feel I have to thank the Allied American military for their wonderful service in those horrible years.